Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jill Baldoff, class of 1981, Associate Dean Alumni Relations at UCLA Anderson. Thank you for joining us today on our second Friday faculty chat that focuses on anti-racism. Our format today will be a discussion by three alumni panelists, moderated by Miguel Unzueta, Senior Associate Dean, MBA Programs, and Professor in Management and Organizations. Today's program was spearheaded by a newly minted alumna, class of 2020, Liza Katzman, and I really want to thank her for stepping up and brainstorming and partnering on ideas with us. That's what it's all about in the Alumni Network. Liza is one of our panelists today. She'll be joined by Devin Dickow, class of 2015, who's the co-lead in diversity, equity, and inclusion at Deloitte, and also by Amber Jackson, also class of 2015, Director of Sales and Marketing at Warner Brothers. They'll speak for approximately 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. You're encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So Miguel Unzueta will go to Q&A and he'll be able to see your questions and ask them of the panelists. As always, we encourage you to share your ideas and your resources and whatever is on the top of your mind on this topic in chat, where we can pick up your thoughts and share with others. So with that, let me turn the program over to Professor Miguel Unzueta. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure to be leading this panel today. I also want to thank Amber, Liza, and Devin, three young alumni that I am very happy to still be interacting with. Liza TA'd, I think, every single class that I have ever taught at UCLA. And Devin was in my class as well back in the day. And Amber, I don't think I had the pleasure of having you in my class, but that's my loss. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the moment that we're in. We're going to talk about the concept of racism. We're going to talk about the concept of allyship. And we're going to hopefully provide some insights into what is different about what's happening now versus what has happened in the past. To get us started, though, we wanted to open up by playing a short video on the concept of systemic racism. So Brianna, can we cue that up and then we'll get the discussion going after that?
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Thanks, Brianna. So I want to open up with a question for our panel. And that is, what feels different about the narrative and the discussion that we're having as a nation now, as opposed to in the past? At least what feels different to you anyway.
I can jump in and start. So what feels different in this moment is who is engaging in the conversation. So for me, as an obvious Black American, we've had these conversations over the years, right? Every time something like police brutality takes place, I'm always hyper aware of it. So I remember where I was in 2014 with Ferguson. And I remember at the time, it never permeated the conversation in my workplace, or if it did, maybe for a news cycle. So it feels really different right now that everybody's talking about it and that we're continuing to talk about it, more than 4 weeks since George Floyd was murdered.
Yeah, just to jump in on what Amber said, I as was kind of mentioned previously, I serve clients, mostly Fortune 500 organizations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've been doing this work ever since I graduated from Anderson. But in the last few weeks, what I've noticed with our clients, with the world's biggest organizations, is as these recent events have permeated public consciousness, and part of it is because many of us are quarantined to our homes and so have time to process what's happening in a really different way than we might otherwise. But it's from employees and workers to customers, the pressure that folks are putting to elevate this conversation to a level of public awareness that didn't exist before is causing pressure upwards and downwards. And so because of this, it's like this self-perpetuating cycle of organizations realizing that they have to do something about it. And because companies and brands are acting, that's keeping it in the public consciousness. They're talking about it in public statements. They're starting to take actions in some cases, maybe not enough yet, but starting to actually take actions, but at least ask the question of, oh, what is systemic racism and how am I as a company contributing to that?
Yeah.
And to also take it down from a really macro level, I think that they were mentioning, but also on a microsphere, I think one of the first times ever, I see non-Black people, or especially white people that care about this, be openly, loudly, really angry and trying to do something about it. And this is a space that I have worked around or near. I've never been a DEI specialist, but it's always been something that's in my doing or to-do list. It's always something that's part of my extracurriculars. It's been a very interesting experience because, for example, I haven't been as loud about certain things on social media. And I feel that for people that don't know me as well are kind of thinking, well, where's your anger? Why aren't you outraged about this? And it's been a very interesting conversation because I kind of have a response of, well, where were you a year ago or 2 years ago? And so I think it's both good and bad. I think, and I hope that that anger will continue and translate and move beyond just the conversation because it's popular right now. And I hope that that carries people forward and that they continue to stand up and say something, especially in the places that they have power, which could potentially be in the workplace, and really push on these issues.
Yeah, I think those are great points that you all bring up on sort of what makes this moment feel qualitatively different. If I can answer my own question, what I would say that's different to me now from in the past is that we're talking as a culture about the concept of systemic racism, which even like 5 years back to me felt like that was a concept that was contained to activist circles and to sociologists. It was not the way mainstream America thought about racism. And I find this particularly interesting because I actually wrote my dissertation on the way that non-experts, specifically how white Americans think about the concept of racism. And what I found, this is way back in 2006 is when I graduated from Stanford with my PhD. I found that white Americans tended to default to thinking of racism as nasty attitudes held by individuals. So it was more about the individual bigots, not about policies or procedures that recreate constant inequality along racial lines. And one thing that I found in those sets of studies was that part of the reason why white Americans tended to gravitate towards a more attitudinal definition of racism, it's because that was a safer way of looking at it. So when you think of racism as, well, there are a couple of bigots out there in the world, you don't have to think about the role that you yourself play in maintaining that system. You don't have to play about the role that you play in benefiting from a system that frankly oppresses some and privileges others. So it's just a very interesting moment in that we are all talking about this now. We're talking about systems. We're talking about policies. We're talking about, I mean, people are interested in city budgets. People are calling in to city councils. It's amazing to me the level of detail that people are engaging with to try to think of this problem of racism at a much higher level, on a fully entrenched systemic level. One of the questions that we talked about in preparation for this panel was how people can think about this concept of systemic racism in their own environments, in their own workplaces, in the spaces that they occupy. So I'm just curious if you all had any thoughts on that point. So when we're thinking systemically, obviously it's out there in the world, but we're all part of the world. We're all part of institutions. So I'm just curious how you all think people can go about trying to understand the role that systemic prejudice plays or systemic racism plays in their own environments.
I can start. And I think our employers, the organizations we work for, are not only part of the system that Miguel just alluded to, but they are systems themselves. And so I'll kind of start at that next level down. And I think there's a really large opportunity for us as leaders in our organizations to examine that system. What are the processes that perpetuate potentially systemic inequities within our own organizations just day to day? How we hire people, literally, what are the steps that we make and what are the decisions that we make to bring people into an organization? What happens when we're there? I'm talking about how promotion decisions are made, for example, which is a huge point of bias that I see when I'm working with clients. I examine the data and I see that there are vast inequities between certain identity groups and others. If you normalize for performance ratings, if you look at promotion rates, there are very often pretty significant inequity. So something is happening systemically. They're getting the same performance ratings, but they're not being promoted as often. So something's happening similar to the video that you all saw at the beginning here. So we can actually examine our own organizations for those systems and processes. And for those of us that don't necessarily work in HR, who don't control kind of the standard operating procedures or practices, we all are involved in managing people, though. We all have colleagues that we collaborate with every day. So even those micro moments that are part of the experience for our colleagues, for the people that we manage, all of those contribute to that system as well. If we define culture as behavior, so all the behaviors that we exhibit on a day-to-day basis, how we work together, we can all play a role in changing that culture. And it can start with examining that system and what are the behaviors that we can change to improve that system.
Yeah, I love it. One of the things that I talk about within my circles is get curious. It's like a big part of my brand is I love curiosity and asking questions. And really we should be approaching our workplaces as an attempt to try to excavate the unknown, right? So instead of us trying to spend time proving, does racism exist? It's actually faster. Let's just assume that it's here, right? That if you were, the way that companies are built, are started by a small group of people who are genuinely like have diverse talents, but are like-minded. And then as they grow from there and add to their numbers, that's how you create a corporate culture. So we can just assume that if the company that you started it looks like a very non-Black, non-diverse space, then let's just start on the assumption that there's something here systematic that enables racism to permeate our workplace today. So let's just get curious. Right? Let's ask questions. Let's try to figure out, hey, this process, this thing that I take for granted, how I exist within this workplace, can I see evidence that everybody around me, if you have people of color, do I think they're having the same experience? Do I think they're getting the same access? Do they get the same opportunities? Can I see evidence of that? And let's get curious, and literally it becomes like let's just assume racism is here, and what we're actually trying to do is excavate the unknown, and that's what we can do through getting curious.
One piece that I kind of to take it, I feel like I take like these like incredibly big concepts that Devin and Amber have, and I'm like, for an example, like a small tiny blip. I actually heard someone on a panel another day speaking, and this was something that was incredibly true at a organization I used to work for. So there was a lot of white male leadership, but they were incredibly kind. They were open, had a very true to form open door policy. And people really did stop by their office like all the time, asking questions. It seemed like a really positive culture. But if you were to take really a step back and peer into who felt comfortable stopping by that person's office, that was when, there were moments where I didn't necessarily feel comfortable stopping by his office. I was young, female, very openly queer, and I didn't think that aligned very well to some of the people that I saw very often stop by his office and the types of conversations that I overheard, which weren't always work conversations, but there were conversations where I felt that I had nothing to add to or that I could not participate in. And so those are the types of the individual moments that from the outside may seem very inclusive, but in reality, what are some of the underlying systems or truths that do not truly allow for that type of practice to be equitable?
I love that example, Liza, because it hits at the difference between understanding equality versus equity, right? So I feel like the language in our workplaces, and Devin can correct me because he knows this as a profession, but I feel like companies have really strived in recent years for equality, which is different than equity, right? Equality says that the example I use in my mind is if I have two kids who want to buy an ice cream cone and the cone costs $1, equality says that I'm going to give you both $1 so you can go buy an ice cream cone. Equity recognizes that one of the kids has 50 cents and the other has 0. So one kid needs $1 and one kid only needs 50 cents for them to both get access to the same ice cream cone. So in that example that you just gave, tees up, we say open door policy looks like equality, but equity recognizes that some of us have barriers that prevent us from walking into that open office. So the person that's sitting in the office might have to do a little bit more work to go and build a relationship. And with some people in your organization, it will look like them walking into your office. For others, it might mean as a leader, you have to take 15 minutes to schedule a one-on-one to make sure that you're having that personal relationship. And all of us in that system, right, need to recognize that that's what equity looks like. And equity is more powerful than equality.
Yeah, Amber's completely right. I've seen a huge evolution in how organizations are thinking about concepts like equity. My clients would have never even entertained the word equity in their workplaces 5 years ago. Except around compensation, pay equity has definitely been a thing for a while, but there has been some sophistication that's happened over the past few months, especially around the words privilege, equity, racism, which we've already talked about. I also want to go back to kind of how I started this question, which is going back to the data for a second to pull a few points together. What's really interesting is that you can quantify equity in a lot of ways. It's not just around pay equity. So the open door policy point reminded me there are ways of using data sets through something called organizational network analysis to pull metadata from things like emails and Skype pings to people to see where the hubs of power are within an organization. And you can actually map who's getting access to big decisions that are being made or opportunities as they arise. That's just one example, but that's a huge opportunity for us to quantify. And we know our business leaders, all the people I work for, want to see the data, prove to me that this is a problem. We now have ways of quantifying those inequities. And that's a big lever that we can pull to make the case for change, because here we are seeing the world evolve, and we're doing it because it's the right thing to do, but we still need proof that this is happening in some cases, I found with my clients. And there are ways of doing that. And it's just another one.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, and I think it ties back a little bit to the concept of individual versus systemic racism. I think a lot of my colleagues, and I'll just say my white colleagues, they assume that if they show up to an environment and they themselves feel they are free of bias or they're free of prejudice, then they think that therefore the environment is fair and everybody can operate fairly within it. But it doesn't quite work that way. It doesn't work that way when you are, say, the only one of a particular demographic group, where you feel like you're representing not only yourself, but also an entire race of people. It doesn't work that way. So that's why I think it's really important to have empathy and to have data to try to understand how things are being perceived differently. So I think Devin's point about looking at the way network analyses are showing who's talking to who. There's actually academic research by a scholar named Hermania Ibarra. I'll get some articles together that we can share with everybody on this call, where she has looked at the networks within organizations, and not surprisingly, she finds that racial minorities tend to be ostracized to the peripheries of those networks. Same thing for women. It's not intentional, it just happens that way. And it happens that way because of things we just take for granted. Like, it's easy for me to talk about sports. It's probably really easy for a bunch of other guys to talk about sports. I'm not trying to be prejudiced. I'm not trying to be sexist. It just happens to have that outcome. And so one thing that I think is really powerful about thinking systemically, you don't need intent to create an inequitable outcome. You just need processes that go unanalyzed, that people don't apply their curiosity to try to understand why this is happening. So there's a question on the Q&A board from Daisha Chung, and I apologize if I mispronounce her name. I don't have the phonetic spelling in front of me. She's class of 2015. She says, hi, Devin and Amber. She says, can you share some relevant metrics that organizations can or should establish to measure progress made against D&I goals?
I could talk about this for hours, so I'll start. Hi, Daisha, good to see your question. So there are a lot of considerations when we think about how organizations can start to quantify and measure these things. And something I haven't mentioned yet is there's a lot of legal implications and risk implications here. So what data can we collect, how we can use that data? Because to Amber's point earlier about curiosity, if we start investigating these things, if we are curious and ask the questions, actually we put ourselves, I'm talking about us as organizations, at risk, because if we find out that there is systemic inequity, then we can be sued. And so I often spend a lot of time working with my clients on what can we actually ask and collect So that needs to be the first step in this conversation. And organizations are becoming a little bit less risk averse over time, especially with societal pressure. But most of our employers, I'm sure, are still very risk averse. So I'll start there. I think when I think about establishing goals, measuring progress, we can think about it in chunks of the talent lifecycle. We can also think about it in terms of identity groups. And one of the reasons that most organizations focus on measuring gender, especially global organizations, is that gender identity as a binary, so usually man, woman, unfortunately, because in some countries, upwards of 10% of the new generation identifies as non-binary or non-conforming. But let's say gender as a binary, that's easy to measure globally. That's a question that we can legally ask in almost every country around the world. Beyond gender identity, actually, there are very few other identity characteristics that are easy to ask about and measure around the world. And so if we say that, okay, so let's look at gender. Now, what other data sets are available? Well, performance management sits in a different system. And so we have to merge that together with our identity data. And there's so much complexity there, add in the legal and risk complications, that starting with some basic stuff like hiring rates and promotion rates is probably the best place to start. And progress should be around benchmarking against ourselves. So I'll kind of make that point as well. A lot of organizations ask me, what does good look like? What should we be striving for? What goals can we set? Targets are illegal in the US actually, but what goals, non-targets, but what goals can we set around things like race and ethnicity? And I would ask them, where are you trying to go? What's your aspiration? Think about things like available talent market, of course, and don't benchmark against the world. No one is doing this well enough yet, but an approach to measuring progress should be, what is our baseline today? And then how can we make progress over time? And that should be success. And if every organization did that, we need to improve by 5% or 10% on these three metrics, then that would have a huge impact on the system overall. But happy to talk more about that. I can talk about it for hours.
Yeah, I know one thing that people oftentimes misunderstand about affirmative action policies is that these policies are really set up to try to correct for underutilization of minority group members who are qualified for a particular position, right? So if you're looking at academia, you would look at the percent of management PhDs that go to African Americans, that go to US born Latinos, and then you compare that percentage to how you're doing at your own school with regards to representation. And then that becomes the target. You're trying to get to that base rate. I think oftentimes people have this perception that it's about getting to 50-50 or completely, and then people very quickly fall back on, well, but the pipeline isn't that robust. There's not that many out there. And it's like, okay, like let's relax a little bit and try to understand that a lot of these goals are actually they're quite achievable if companies take them seriously, and if people actually care about trying to achieve commensurate representation with the available pool of qualified individuals from particular groups. Amber or Eliza, you want to come in on this question at all in terms of measures we should be looking at? We talked about hiring, promotion. Anything else we're missing?
Not from my side, but one point that you did just bring up that unrelated to quantitative, but I think is still important, is looking at pipeline, right? And so I think that's crucial. So like I work in entertainment, underrepresented in the organization. But one of the things that like I do with my time and my passion is look at like pipeline, right? So people, I love Gina Davis. She has the Gina Davis Institute, which studies like representation of women in film. But one of the things that she really messages that she broadcasts is that if she can see it, she can be it, right? Like that we have to see ourselves. Representation matters, because in order to build a pipeline, there's like a little Black girl in Pittsburgh that needs to know that she can dream to have my job. But if she doesn't even know that there's a whole business of entertainment unrelated to what happens in front of and behind the camera, she never knows how to aspire to it. She doesn't know what to go to college and to study. She doesn't know how to find the networks that create entry points into this industry. So I think I spend a lot of time thinking about pipeline as young as possible, as broadly as possible. And how can you just show people that this is an opportunity, how to go after it, how to dream for it, how to work for it, to be available when companies catch up and have changed their practices, to make sure that they're looking at diverse slates as they're looking at candidates to potentially bring into the company.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one thing I would also encourage people to pay attention to is just pay attention to the demographics within your own organization, right? Look at management, look at the entry level, look at who's actually making decisions. We're here in an alumni event. One thing I would encourage you to do, I just sent you all a link to our office, the UCLA Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. This is their dashboard where you can actually go and look and see the demographics of professors at UCLA. You can filter it all the way down to Anderson. And what you're going to find is that we have, out of approximately 90 tenure track faculty, we have 2 professors that are identified as underrepresented minorities, one African American and one Latino American, who is talking right now into your camera. I'm talking about myself. So I would just encourage you all, and like Amber said earlier on, right, this idea of curiosity, I would encourage you all to look at the demographics of institutions you care about, like UCLA Anderson, like your own workplace, and ask yourself, why is that happening? What is the organization doing or not doing that might actually change that? And if this is something that you care about, as many of you have said you care about it, I would then start asking questions of leadership. Start asking questions, start trying to figure out what's going on. Use that curiosity, use this training that you have to try to get to the bottom of it. And frankly, to also put pressure on these leaders to have a coherent answer as to what is happening. It's simply not good enough to say, well, we don't know, it just works out that way. You're in charge. You're supposed to know what's happening in your organization. And that's where people like Devin come in terms of trying to help to understand why it's happening. And that's where these roles are so critical. So I would start there. I would say that's one of the metrics to pay attention to, is just look at the demographics and ask yourself why. A question that we also talked about before our session was, how do you approach talking about race or discrimination in the workplace? I know a lot of people have brought this issue up because it's difficult to do so. People feel they fall into traps or say the wrong thing, conversation shuts down. So I'm just curious if you all have any ideas for how you can try to begin conversations about race and discrimination at work.
So I think that there's 2 kind of ways to look at this. One is begin a fresh conversation when no one's talking about it and you want to be the first. The other is when you overhear something or someone says something to you that is potentially, the buzzword of the moment is problematic. And for the second one, and this is something that for folks that know me, this would be no surprise. What I do is if sometimes people say something that they don't realize is kind of problematic, or they make a generalization, not necessarily overtly racist, but perhaps has an implicit bias or, an undertone to it. And what I have done in the past is just simply ask the person, what do you mean by that? And having somebody stop and have to think about or explain what they meant by a certain statement, right? Like, one time I just had someone say to me like, yeah, talking about something that was stereotypically male and was just kind of like, yeah, but, I don't really think you'd understand. And I kind of said, why? Well, I don't really think you'd be into that kind of thing. Why? And not in a mean way. I'm just like, oh, I'm curious why you think that. Yeah. And sometimes that, it starts a conversation. It can just start a conversation. Of course, there's instances where people can get defensive, and that is a risk that I'm personally willing to take. I know that not everybody is willing to take that risk. But that is one thing that I have found can work without, being like, yo, that was racist, or that was sexist, or that was, just asking why somebody said something kind of in a way has them examine themselves without you having to call them out in like a really explicit way.
Yeah, it's also a great way of whenever you're faced with a microaggression or just a comment that you're like, where is that coming from exactly? Trying not to get defensive, and simply asking why is another way of trying to confront the person with, hopefully with a softer touch that can actually get a conversation started versus people retreating to their corners trying to protect themselves.
Yeah, microaggressions are hard. It's something that I've experienced in the workplace, and it's uncomfortable because when they happen, they're an educational moment, but you
Yeah.
need the person who demonstrated the behavior to stay open, right? So if somebody kind of calls you out and says, hey, like, to, asks you the question why, or if you see me flinch when you try to touch my hair, right? Like, these are moments to stay open and understand that there's intent and there's behavior, and somebody can't see your intent. They only see your behavior. So if somebody is coming back to you, they're responding to your behavior. So maybe you need to add more information about your intent, which might have, had the best intentions behind it, but the behavior came across to them in a way that they felt offended. And I think the other part too is that, for me personally, like, I try to really be sensitive around using the term even racist. It's so inflammatory, right? As soon as you bring it out, like, walls go up. And so I always just try to remember, attach it to the behavior. This is about behaviors. We're not trying to attack people who they are and their innate beings, but we're just trying to say, you demonstrate a behavior that I'm perceiving you gave to me because of my racial identity. It feels racist, but let's get information. What was your intent? What were you trying to do? What were you trying to say? Maybe it came out wrong, or maybe it came out right, and we just have an opportunity to learn here for a moment.
I think the other thing that majority group members don't appreciate about microaggressions, each microaggression in and of itself, you could say, well, that's not that big of a deal. It's just one thing, but they add up, right? It's death by 1,000 cuts. It's a lifetime of having to deal with comments that make you feel like you don't belong, like you're strange, like this is not a space for you. And so I think that's another important difference from this moment. I do hope that men listening to women and white Americans listening to racial minorities in this moment, trying to understand what these concepts are and why they hurt so much. So I do hope that people are in a position where they're listening and they're paying attention and they're learning from what your colleagues around you who don't share your majority identities, what they experience and what it's like on a daily basis. There's yeah, Liza, you want to come back in?
Yeah. I actually just kind of thought of something in terms of starting a conversation about race or injustice or inequity in the workplace. And sometimes there is a sense of, you don't bring politics into the workplace, or, that's a bit of an excuse that people say, I don't want to talk about this, but there is something to be said for common interest or common community and common experience. And so one thing I've done in the past is perhaps invited someone to, for example, an event, like an ERG event that someone was throwing, and said, our Black employees group is putting on this event, and I know that you have this interest in these types of films. Well, they're doing this thing. Do you want to come with me or talk about that event that they're doing? Or, a new TV show on Netflix, because people talk about that stuff all the time. Oh, well, have you seen, Dear White People? Have you seen, a documentary that they have on? And sometimes when it's discussing a different topic or a different piece of material or a commonality, I think there's a potential for more open dialogue, because it's not just about, oh, me and what I do and what I think about this. It's, oh yeah, we both saw this documentary and it was really interesting. And here is this subject matter that also came up in it that talked about how, the school to prison pipeline. And then it kind of flows into that. So I think that people get really creative about bringing up a lot of topics at work that nobody would ever expect are brought up. And, if they can do that, like somehow people start talking about being nursing mothers or whatever it is, people can also start talking about injustice and racism and, things that are affecting most certainly, people that are in the workplace around you.
There's a question in the Q&A channel. I'll summarize it, and it's directed at something you said a little bit earlier, Devin. The gist of it is I'm open to learning about this, but I'm concerned about the legal implication of setting specific goals, specific diversity goals. Outside counsel has indicated that we need to be very careful in making any specific quantifiable goals. So how do we do this in a relatively small company without running afoul of the law? So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about how those goals are established, how they are done so in a way that are not going to run afoul of the law, and in a way that is actually something that becomes actionable.
Yeah, for those who can't see the question, I'll just mention something at the beginning of it as well, because I think it's relevant, which is something I've heard a lot about recently in the beauty industry. There's this challenge called the PullUp challenge. And so the context of this question is being asked is many beauty companies are being asked to increase their numbers of certain types of identity groups, especially right now, Black members of the workforce. And so I'll answer that part of it first, actually, for a moment, and say for smaller organizations, this one looks like it has 80 members of the workforce. I would, instead of maybe setting a goal or a target, which with 80 people in your workforce could mean a percentage point can mean a person, then I think there's an opportunity actually to instead examine processes again. So I'll go back to what I said before, but I'll get a little more detailed. Let's think about how we're writing our job descriptions. Our job descriptions for our organization were most likely, maybe they've been iterated over time, but I bet the first person that wrote that was a white person. I bet the first person that wrote a version of the job description was a man. Most of our employers were founded by straight white men, and because our companies were founded by these folks, they have perpetuated certain cultural norms and behaviors. And actually, I'm sure Miguel can speak a lot about this, but even just the language in job descriptions can influence the people who apply for a position. And so you may not be tapping into available talent if you're listing too many requirements for a job, or you use certain words in the job description. Then we think about once someone does apply, who's involved in those hiring decisions? What is the diversity of the panel of decision makers? What are the steps in the process? Is it creating equal access to those steps in the process? So are we actually systemically making it harder for folks of certain identity groups to be successful in the process, and not recognizing that perhaps the strengths that they bring to a potential position may not be exactly what you have on paper, but they might even be better for the role. Maybe the creativity and innovation that they bring to the role is harder to articulate in a role description or a role profile, but that's actually better than an extra 5 years of work experience that would be more likely present in an applicant who looks like the other members of your workforce. So for smaller organizations, I would actually encourage you to veer away from goal setting around stuff like this and think about some of those processes to both bring people in, but then also to keep people there. Because it's great if you bring them in the door, but if they leave after 6 months because they're not successful, because they don't feel like they belong, they don't have psychological safety, think about the culture and what it means to build a culture of inclusion, of equity, of belonging, so folks feel like they can contribute and be their best there. On the goal piece, for larger organizations, I mean, I think I kind of hit some of the big pieces before, but work with your general counsels, obviously. I think that when goal setting, thinking about realistic goals that make sense from a business perspective is really important. So we're not going to just arbitrarily set a goal of 50-50, kind of as we were saying before. We're going to think about what best benefits our business. That might be a good lens through which to start thinking about goal setting. What are we actually trying to achieve here? It shouldn't just be, oh, someone told me I need to reach these numbers. What is the actual business reason? And that can inform the decision-making process.
Since we're sort of starting to talk a little bit about specific diversity practices, I wanted to share just some quick data from a classic paper in sociology on this topic. So let me just figure out how to do that really quick here. Okay, so I think I'm sharing the PowerPoint. So this is a study that came out in 2006 by sociologists. I think they're Harvard and Yale. Dobbin certainly is a sociologist at Harvard. This is data collected from 1971 through 2002, where they were looking at which specific diversity practices that companies implemented led to a percentage change of the demographic of managers in these 700 organizations. Specifically, they're looking at the percent change in number of Black managers added after the intervention was put in place. The actual interventions are on the top of the chart. It ranges from having an affirmative action plan, having a specific diversity committee, having staff dedicated towards diversity, diversity training like implicit bias training, diversity evaluations that refers to evaluating individual employees for how much they contribute to the diversity or the inclusion of the environment, programs around networking and mentoring programs. And the question is, which of these programs actually lead to the most change? That is, which actually increase the number of Black managers? I'll just sort of summarize the results here. It's basically this right here. So this over here is the specific group that is being affected. And what you tend to find is that the plans or the interventions that actually lead to the most demographic change by leading to an increase in underrepresented identities, in this case, white women, Black women, and Black men, are policies that are much more at the institutional level. So having an affirmative action plan, having a committee dedicated to monitoring these problems, and then having staff dedicated to work on them, that's what actually leads to change. One thing that always fascinates me about this study is that if you look right in the middle at diversity training, that does nothing in and by itself. And one thing that I've noticed is that so many companies want to bring out diversity trainers to give implicit bias talks. And then that's it. That's all they do. And not surprisingly, nothing happens. Nothing actually changes. I'm happy to share the actual paper. They do find the diversity training can have some positive impact on diversity of the organization, so long as the diversity or the affirmative action plan committee and staff are in place. Once those institutional factors are in place, then these other things have an impact. And then this same paper I thought was interesting in terms of which practices were prevalent during this particular range of data. The most popular was having an affirmative action plan. After that, it's the diamond, it's diversity training. Saw a huge jump starting into the 90s into the present day. So it seems like organizations are not doing the things that we know actually change the demographics, and they tend to be favoring things like diversity training, independent of these more structural interventions. So I just wanted to show that really quickly to give you a little bit more of a research backing. One question that was asked is, are there any specific policies that you all have seen at work that seem to actually yield a change to the demographic of employees in your organizations?
Sadly, no. I mean, I work for mostly like Fortune 100 companies in my entire career. And I worked for four different companies. And I would say that looking over the past 20 years, that the diversity, like employment levels, have mostly stayed the same, at least from what I can, kind of qualitatively observe.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. I mean, even when I looked at Anderson, right, institution I care a lot about, I think that if I look at the number of like enrolled, identifying as Black students in the full-time or member program, it's mostly stayed the same over the past, 20 plus years.
Go ahead, Devin.
A few examples of things that I've seen work. One of the most common challenges I hear about is our most senior levels of leadership are not diverse enough. They struggle the most. It's not in the hiring of the lower levels necessarily, although there's a lot to do there, but it's keeping senior people that look like us. When I was in business school, Tim Cook came out as the first openly gay CEO of a Fortune 500 company. That didn't exist before I was in business school. So when I looked into corporate America, and I come from nonprofit, so Anderson was also my first entry into the corporate world. I was like, what? Whoa, this is a big deal, and really important to see people like me in senior levels of leadership. So something that I've seen work effectively, and Fortune even 10 companies that I've worked with is a focus on the super senior levels. And the way that we can do that is to think about the way roles are structured. For example, where a role needs to be geographically can make a big difference. And of course, this conversation has changed a lot since the pandemic. But before this, often big companies are headquartered in places that maybe aren't as inclusive for folks of different backgrounds. I would not move to some of the states of where certain companies are headquartered because I wouldn't feel safe being with my husband and my family. And so I've seen organizations kind of broaden their expectations of where senior executives sit, literally physically sit within an organization as one intervention. Another thing that I've seen a lot of is the equity equality conversation again. So what is the support that maybe the first Black woman VP at a company might need to be successful, and so that she doesn't feel the burden of being the one Black woman who is the image of success perhaps for that organization, and shouldering all of that mentorship, sponsorship, requests to be on panels and interviews. I mean, those women often, I hear stories, are asked a lot from them. So how can the company actually focus on supporting those folks to be successful so they can deliver on the core aspects of their job so they have equal chance of success? So that's at the super senior level. At the middle manager level, I see a lot of conversation around how do we actually embed inclusive leadership as a capability into the everyday managers that touch every member of the workforce, and seeing inclusive leadership as a practice that needs to be cultivated over a period of time, and then needs to be accountability for that can make a big difference. And on the hiring front, one specific example, my employer actually does this. So we have diversified the schools which we recruit from. So Deloitte recruits from UCLA and other prestigious universities, but we've thought a lot about over the past few years specifically of how can we diversify the schools that we go to get that post-MBA talent, for example. And maybe it's not the top 20 business schools necessarily, but there are amazingly qualified people at non-top 20 business schools that can also be so additive to our practice and potentially diversify the pipeline of folks that are coming into the organization. And that has been successful for us.
That's one thing I've noticed in academic recruitment. I mean, in general, we tend to rely on networks that we've built given the schools that we attended for our PhDs. And so not surprisingly, if you look at the type of school that a typical Anderson faculty went to, we're talking Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago. So that's a very specific network. And it's also a network characterized by the underrepresentation of African-American academics, Latinos, and even women, depending on the field. So if all you're doing is relying on your friends and colleagues that you met through that network, you're getting a very skewed picture of the field, as opposed to opening yourself up to other schools, not just the 5 schools that you consider to be above you in status, for example. So I think it's very important to be sensitive to that. And then we can get into questions as to, well, why aren't there more Black PhD students, say, in the top 5 PhD programs? Well, I'll refer you back to that video that we talked about earlier. This is the legacy of systemic racism, right? It doesn't mean that anybody is trying to do this. It just happens that way given the way society is structured. Opportunities are handed out at a young age. We can get into it all. But I think it's very important, like Devin just said, to broaden those networks, to not just rely on the quote unquote top schools, and realize there's a lot of talent spread out everywhere. Just not everybody gets a shot at those top universities.
Yeah, and I would add, I completely agree with everything both Devin and Miguel have said, and I would just add a personal experience. So, I hire MBA interns every summer, and last year for the first time, my company made an effort to have a presence at the National Black MBA Conference, which was in Houston, Texas. And it was our first time going there. And yeah, when I tell people I'm going to recruit at National Black, I understand people are like, oh, well, why are you just going to like recruit Black people? And what's amazing is that if you actually go to National Black, maybe 50 to 60% of the attendees are actually like Black. It actually is an incredibly diverse conference, right? And so we hired from there both an African-American as well as Asian-American. Like we hired diverse people. So it's more, people are afraid, I think, of the pendulum going fully like to the other side, whatever that means. But actually looking for going into diverse spaces actually just gives you a more diverse pool of candidates to look at versus what you're attracting if you just go to the UCLA, the Harvard, the Stanford networks, et cetera.
I also definitely, and I just kind of thought about this thinking back to, so I was a leader in an ERG, employee resource group, back in the day. And one piece that I think, or a topic that comes up around this is also that employers are kind of like, oh, well, sure, it's the right thing to do, but is it bringing us any money, right? Because the topic around, is this going to benefit us financially, comes up a lot. And one practice that I started to started to shift in my previous company was ERG members and ERG leaders started to get asked for input on certain business decisions that, you know, were around certain demographic targets, right? Or certain audiences that, you know, a certain, you know, TV show was for, or a movie. And those inputs started to become really valuable pieces of input in terms of how to actively and rightfully, you know, engage the audience that they were trying to engage. Because if the major decision makers aren't tapping into the audience that they are trying to reach, then inevitably they will fall short. And so it started to become a business case as well, which I think, you know, a lot of us have read about, oh, you know, the business case for diversity and why it matters and why there's business dollars. But having certain procedures or processes in place, for example, having ERGs not just throw diversity events, but also tapping them for business knowledge and business advice, is something that I've seen, A, both empower people within those ERGs, and B, also open up doors to opportunities where, oh, now there's a marketing manager in a certain department that talks to a certain ERG leader and is like, wow, you work in this other department, but you're actually a genius in this space. And it opens up those networks and those doors to be able to find talent from a diverse pool that you may not have ever thought of because they don't have 10 years of marketing experience on their resume.
Yeah. We have about 3 minutes remaining, and I'm a college professor, so I have to ask you all if there's any books or reading that you would recommend to folks. I see, Devin, you got a couple of books on the back there. Any of those you want to recommend to our audience?
Definitely. So this panel has already talked about this one. So you want to talk about Race by Ajoma Oluo. This is one that folks are talking about a lot these days. How to be anti-racist is also something that my clients are finally acknowledging is important. Like owning that word anti-racism and questioning what does that mean in a corporate setting. So this book has had a lot of impact in the corporate sector.
If I could just interrupt you really quickly
please.
on that since we talked about anti-racism, a lot of people have been asking me what the difference is between non-racist and anti-racist. And again, being a college professor, I have a definition for you. So non-racism, you can think of it as a racially liberal approach to race that favors passive behaviors, discourses, and ideologies that reject extreme forms of racism. It's basically saying that the KKK is a fringe group that we do not support and that is horrendous in so many different ways. Yes, we all agree with that. Being anti-racist, on the other hand, it's an active rejection of the institutional and structural aspects of race and racism. It's thinking at a system level. It's coming up with system level solutions to underrepresentation, to things like that. So an anti-racist discourse is about systems, not about individual bigots. So Devin, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. That's an important call out. Last one for white folks especially, but for non-white folks too, White Fragility is a great one.
So I'll go next because Devin had two of my, I was going to give you White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist as well. So this is like double stamp of please go and read. And then I would say one of the most important white papers that I like to read every year is called Women in the Workplace. It's a study that's produced every year by Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In organization with McKinsey and Company. And it's an in-depth look at women in the workplace, but it does a really great job of looking at intersectional identity, right? So we didn't talk about it today, but for people who share multiple marginalized identities like myself, I'm African American and I'm a woman, we experience racism different than I experience it different than white women and then Black men, right? That's great. There's a third level that I experience in an intersectional identity. So it does a really great job to further just understand that we are all having a different experience in the workplace. So I highly recommend reading. And also you have to look for information. I will say, I think that we're just learning how to talk about systemic racism in the workplace. There's not a ton of resources out there to talk about tokenism or microaggressions, or to talk about glass cliffs, which is where when we do bring opportunities to people of color, they're typically like the exceptional work project that less than 5% of the population could solve for. So glass cliffs, it's a false opportunity. So you have to go and look, you have to read HBR, like Harvard Business Review, articles, et cetera, but the information's out there, it's being created, and it's our responsibility to go and find it, consume it, and leverage it.
There you go.
And if I could have 15 seconds, the reading that like changed my entire view on racism and privilege was Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, I believe is the title.
Yeah. Peggy McIntosh.
Thank you. It's one of the most just pivotal readings around this space, but it made me realize that as a queer woman, I still have a ton of privilege and I didn't understand what that looked like. And it just is just extremely, it made privilege not a bad word, which was just really, really powerful.
Yeah, we'll put together a list, right, Jill? We can put that together and get it out to folks.
Yeah, I've typed them in the chats, but we'll definitely follow up everyone with the list of books, with the slides, with the papers that everyone has referred to. This has just been a fabulous chat. I personally have picked up a lot of really good tips that I'm going to practice. The idea of talking about behavior rather than intent, and the use of what did you mean by that? Those are just some wonderful, wonderful tips that we will be utilizing daily. So thank you very much, Amber and Liza and Devin. Thank you, Miguel, for moderating the panel. It was really wonderful. I do want to encourage everyone to please join our Slack channel and be part of the conversation. Send us ideas on topics, programming, and speakers. We'll be taking a hiatus for the 4th of July, but we'll be back again with more programming later in July. So have a safe and happy 4th, and stay healthy, stay safe. And thank you so much for being part of the conversation.